Well, welcome back. This is Brian Kidd with Unriddler. We are today talking about the SAP ALV grid. And in this section, we're going to talk about filtering of the data. It would make sense that having all of this data available to us, and although we may apply a filter on the selection screen, uh, during some analysis, we may choose to only look at a subset of the data. And we've got a couple of ways to do that. We could always sort it to try to get that data together, but uh, then we're going to run in a little bit of an issue with seeing some totals if we want to see it on the filtered data. And that's when we're going to use the filtering option to only focus on those rows of data that we care about for whatever we're doing at the time. And we're going to talk about a very simple single value filter. We'll also learn about how we can filter based on a range. So if you have a range of dates that we may want to filter on just postings for January, we have the option to apply a range. And then if there are some data sets that we want to only focus on certain values, and using a range doesn't make sense because within that range we would be displaying data that we don't want to see. In that case, we may choose to filter on multiple single values, and we'll talk about how we do that. And then I'm going to end with just briefly talking about uh, how we optimize our settings for filters. And when I say optimize, it's looking at the data and what we actually want to see and applying the right filters. Sometimes it may make sense to exclude a data set or a data value rather than trying to, on the filter, say I want to see 10 different cost centers. It may be easier when I only have 12 cost centers to start with. It may be easier for me to just enter the two that I do not want to see. So I'll briefly talk about how we can add uh, filters that in turn exclude data. Okay, back in SAP on the SAP ALV grid, we're talking about filtering in this section. So we're going to go back and use the same method that we used before. We'll first see how to use it, the filtering within the change layout dialog, and then I'll show you how to filter on data directly on the grid. So let's open the ALV change layout dialog screen. And as we talked in the previous section about sort order, we also have a tab here for filtering. And within filtering, we're going to see this a similar format in that our column set is listed on the right, and the columns that we have selected to filter on will be on the left-hand side. And you can see that on the screen here that we currently do not have any columns that we've selected to filter on. But I'm going to change that. I'm going to choose to add a cost element screen, I'm sorry, for column for filtering. I'm going to move that over uh, using the same method that I used before. Now, if I chose the wrong column, it's just as easy to move it off the list by clicking the same uh, type of button, but this button actually moves it over to the right. But I actually do want that column, so I'm going to move it over to the left. And in this case, I want to filter on this cost element that we can see here in the background, 416300. Uh, with the filter settings, they are a little bit different than some of the other things that we've seen because there is a second step associated with filtering criteria. Now, if I chose this column and chose to adopt it, the system would recognize that I haven't applied any criteria and it would open the screen for me. But I want you to notice that down in the lower part of the dialog that we have this second step, determine values for filter criteria. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to get a second dialog, and you can see that it's showing my cost element column that I selected, and I have one one text box where I can enter data, and I have a second one, and we'll talk about this when we talk about ranges, and then we have this button here for multiple selections that we'll discuss as well. But in this case, I only want to filter on cost element 416300. So let's enter 416300. And to adopt those changes to the change layout dialog, I'll again click this green check. Now in this case, it's giving me a tooltip that says execute, but it essentially means to just continue what you're doing. So I'm going to choose continue, and that filter is now saved, and I can go ahead and adopt those changes to the current report. Now we've applied a filter to only see cost element 416300. We're only seeing rows that meet the criteria. So we only have 3 records that meet the criteria. And we again, in the column header, we have another icon. It looks like a triangle from this, with it being so small, but it's actually more of a filter icon like we see up here. It's a little different, but it's in the same format. But what this tells us is very easily, it tells us that, hey, we have applied a filter to this cost element. So I always encourage people, if you're using a report that you haven't used before, and especially if it has a default layout, be sure to look across the columns or even open the change layout screen, because many times there'll be a filter applied on the default layout uh, that we may or may not be aware of. So I encourage people to look at that, because what will happen, they'll enter some selection criteria on the selection screen. They run the report and they'll see uh, less records than they're expecting, or maybe even see what seems quite strange, to have a report return with no records on it. But that can happen if the default layout has a filter already applied on it. So I would encourage you, if you're using a report that you haven't used, or especially using a layout that you haven't used, be sure that before you start making decisions on that data, that you're actually seeing what you're expecting to see. And a filter being applied to a default layout has caused many people problems, and I just wanted to mention that you should check that. But we see this filter icon that we have applied a filter here, and that's very helpful to know that we're not seeing all the data that based on what we entered on the selection screen. We're seeing data filtered even further on the ALV grid. Okay, I'm going to go back to the change layout dialog, and I'm going to remove this column from the filter, but we're going to apply it a different way. Okay, we're back to our data set, but I want to show that from the ALV grid, we can also apply a filter, and it does have something to do with this option on the toolbar. What we first need to do is choose cost element. Now let me show you what happens if I do not choose cost element. If I click on the filter, it's simply going to open that change layout dialog, and it's a bit altered because it's only focusing on filters, so I don't have those other tabs, but I have a very similar screen as I see in the change layout dialog, where I can choose the columns. But I'm going to close this out, and maybe out of habit or trying to do it as quickly as possible, I like to choose the column first. And once I choose the column and saying, hey, this is the column that I want to apply the filter to, I can now click on the filter button and get that second dialog screen that we've gotten in the past when we looked at this from the change layout. So from here, I'm going to again enter my 416300, and I'm going to apply those changes, and I again have the filter. So I've applied the filter simply by using the ALV grid options rather than open the change layout dialog. I want to show one other option that I really like, and I use this quite often. I'm going to go back and remove this filter. And we're back to our data set. What I tend to do, if there is one particular cost element that, let's say I'm focusing on the cost element that has this water description here, if I want to focus strictly on this cost element, what I'll tend to do is, instead of choosing the column header as I did here, I'll choose the actual value that I want, which is 416300, and from here I right click and I get this context menu. And within the context menu, you have several different options, but the one that I'm focusing on currently is I'm choosing Set Filter. And a really neat thing happens because I've not only told the ALV grid that I want to filter on the cost element field, I've actually chosen a cell within the cost element data, and I'm choosing Set Filter. And you'll notice what will happen is, because I right click and chose Set Filter on that cell value, it has pre-populated that for me. So now that I have that already populated, I can just choose to apply those changes. So that's another trick, that if you already see the value that you want to focus on the current screen, choose to select that value, right click, get this short context menu, and apply the filter from here. It's quite handy. Okay, let's move on, and I'm going to remove this filter just so we can start with a clean slate. Okay, we've seen filtering on the cost element, but let's say that instead of wanting to see a specific cost element, we want to focus on posting dates uh, for a specific month. And in this case, I want to focus on January and focus on the data, uh, only data that's relevant for January posting. So in this case, you can see I have a number of line items that have a posting date that occurred within January. So I'm going to again select my column here, and I'm going to from now on, I'm going to work off of the screen, but these same concepts are available to you from the change layout. We're just kind of taking a shortcut to get to that second dialog where we actually put in the selection criteria. So I'm going to choose posting date, and I'm going to apply the filter. I'm going to set the filter, and then within the filter, I'm going to choose to put in 01 01 2009 to 01 31 2009. So now I'm telling the system that I want to see a range, and I want the range to be on the posting date from January 1st to January 31st. So let's apply that. And now we can see again our little icon on the posting date, and we can also see that I'm only seeing records for January. I'm not seeing all those other records that we saw before. So that's how we see and apply a filter based on the posting date. And I'm going to use a change layout to remove this, but I want to just prove to you that regardless of how I go about doing this, we see our posting date here. If I were to click this button, we would get the same determine values for filter criteria dialog that we got previously. So this, what I'm doing from the screen by using the set filter button, is just a shortcut to get to the screen. So I'm going to remove this and go back to a clean slate. We're seeing our full data set again. And this time we're going to talk about applying a filter on multiple cost elements. And in this case, I may be an administrator for multiple cost elements, but I want to only focus on, let's say, anything related to building or infrastructure related things. And in this case, I may to only choose to see uh, building maintenance and office and building cost elements. So what we're going to do is only going to focus on these two. Now, you can see what would happen here if I were to apply a range that started with 451,000 and it went up to 470,000. I would also pick up insurance expenses, which in this case I don't want to focus on. I only want to focus on building maintenance and office and building cost element. So in this case, we want to apply a filter, but apply the filter on uh, multiple values, multiple single values. So I'm going to again open the change layout dialog. I'm going to go to filter. I'm going to choose cost element, move it over, and then I'm going to open the second dialog where we actually put the criteria in. And instead of entering a value here, I could put the first value here, but instead I'm going to choose this multiple selection option. And once I choose multiple selection, you'll notice that now I get a even third multiple selection cost element dialog box, and I have multiple options, but we're going to first focus on select single values. So if in my case I want to only see 451,000 and 470,000, I'll enter both of those values here. So 451,000 and 470,000. And from here, and this can be a little bit confusing. We've been clicking the green check box to apply the changes or to continue. In this case, because I've keyed these values in, the green check actually validates that these are valid values. So if I were to enter something like a date, uh, it would come back and say that the data is in the not in the correct format. So that's what the green check does here. To apply this, we actually use this clock icon, which has the text copy. So I'm going to copy that over. Now we again only see the first value here, but you'll notice that our uh, button icon is changed to now have this green rectangle below the arrow, and that indicates to us that multiple selection is active. And you can even see on the tooltip that it shows us that we have multiple selections active. I'm going to apply that and then finally adopt those changes, and we can see that we have now applied a filter that is only showing us building maintenance and uh, office and building cost element. So we've gotten the data down to exactly what we want to see. We don't have to overlook some data. We can actually dial it into exactly what we want to focus on, which is building maintenance and office and building. So let's go back to our dialog, and this time I am going to choose uh, the quick selection option. And then from here, because I didn't have a column selected, it doesn't know, so it's taking me back here. Okay, what I discussed earlier briefly in the introduction to filtering, I want to talk a little bit about here because you can work yourself quite a bit trying to put the correct selection criteria in to get what you need. But uh, if you find that there's more data that you want to see than what you want to filter out, sometimes it makes sense to just exclude one or two, in this case, cost elements, rather than listing 5 or 10 cost elements that I do want to see. It may be easier for me to say, okay, in my data set, I only have 12 cost elements. and I want to see 10 of those. So maybe the easiest thing to do rather than entering all 10 of those cost elements is to just exclude the two cost elements that we don't want to see. So let's say that instead of wanting to see these two cost elements, I actually want to see everything except for these two cost elements. And in that case, I'm going to remove this, and I can do that quite easily by just clicking this trash can, which would delete all the entries. The single red dash deletes only the current row. So I'm going to show you that when I click that, the first row, and because the cursor is still this column, uh, this row is selected, by clicking that again, it will remove that. But let's go over and instead exclude those single values. So you can see I have this tab that reads exclude single values. So let me enter those in 451000, and on the second line I'll enter 40. So now I'm telling the system, instead of wanting to only see these two columns, I'm wanting to see everything except these two columns. So I'm going to continue by clicking the clock icon, and you'll notice something that happened here. Now I've got this red equal sign, and if I mouse over it, you can see it's do not select equal to, and it's telling me that I'm applying a filter that I do not want to see this data. I still have the green uh, icon below the arrow here indicating that I have multiple selection, but in this case the multiple selection is excluding certain cost elements. Apply that change, and now you can see that we've applied a filter that only shows us the data that is not in the selection criteria. We're only excluding those two cost elements. So it's very handy to first run your data set, have a look at it, and if you feel more comfortable with just entering the values you want to see, you certainly can do that, but it may be worth thinking about if you only want to see certain cost elements, and those cost elements are the bulk of the data. It may make sense to apply the filter to exclude certain cost elements, and I'm talking about cost elements because of the nature of this report, but it could be sales orders, it could be project WBS elements, whatever. You can apply these concepts, but it may make sense for you to only filter by excluding. And finally, I want to show you how to, if you happen to have the selection criteria or the filter criteria already in, uh, for example, Excel, and you really don't want to key all of those in, there is a way to do that, and I want to show you that briefly. Let's open our change layout dialog, and I'm going to remove the filter here so we can get back to a clean data set. Okay, now we're back. And let's go ahead and apply the filter to the cost element column. And because I cleared the field out earlier, I lost all of my selection criteria. But let's again go into our multiple selection, and I want to show you a little easier way of doing that. We have our list here, and we could easily key those in. I say easily, but it depends on how many you have to key in. But I want to show you how you can do this by using another method, and that's it. If you have the data already in an Excel spreadsheet, you can do that quite easily. Let me show you that. Okay, I've opened up an Excel spreadsheet that already has my cost element values in it. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to copy these to my clipboard, and I'm doing this by choosing Control C, but you know the many different ways within Excel to copy data. But I've selected the range, I've copied the data set, and then if I return back to SAP, I just want to make sure that my cursor's here. But I have this option, upload from clipboard, and because I already have that data in a spreadsheet, and it can recognize that these are separate values, I can choose upload from clipboard, and you'll notice that all those values are now displayed on the single value column list. So rather than having to key those in each time, you can certainly um, have those in Excel spreadsheet. But if it's something that you're going to use quite often, you'll want to save it as a layout, and I'll show you how to do that later. But want to show you that if you do have those values, you do not have to key them in. You can copy them to your clipboard and paste them directly from your clipboard. We'll mention that you can also notice that we have the number of values. So obviously I have 8 values that I've entered here, and that is displayed on the dialog. So let's apply that. And now you can see that I'm only seeing the cost elements that I had copied from Excel and pasted in as selection criteria.